As we continue our study of Old Testament history, we're in the second lesson of Joseph. We're nearing the end of the book of Genesis. As I said in the last lesson, Joseph's life to me is one of the most, if not the most interesting historical story in all of the Old Testament. We've seen the princely son. At home, he was his father's pride and joy. He was his father's favorite. He curried his father's favor by tattling, by telling on his brothers when they did wrong. His father indicated his prejudice and his superior love to Joseph by giving him a peculiar, a different, a unique coat, a coat richly ornamented, or a coat of many colors. Joseph manifested his pride by telling the dreams God gave him to promise him superiority and preeminence in the family. He told those dreams to his brother, and then told them to his father and his mother, and the whole family is upset at him because of his prideful claim to be superior to them. His brothers are filled with such jealousy, you remember, that they sell him into Egyptian captivity. They sell him to a passing band of Ishmaelites from Midian, who sell him into the house of Potiphar, who is the captain of Pharaoh's house. Now we start in chapter 39 of Genesis in verse 1 as we look at Joseph, the patient sufferer. And I want you to notice something in verse 1 that'll help us later on to understand why Egypt and Egyptians who hated and who detested and counted as nobody, shepherds, are going to make a shepherd prime minister and a shepherd nation preeminent within their nation. 39 verse 1. Read it with me. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Who would you expect to be captain of Egyptian guard? Wouldn't you expect it to be an Egyptian? Why do we read Potiphar, an Egyptian, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard? Suppose the Pharaoh was not an Egyptian. There are periods in Egypt's history where they're ruled by foreign kings. And this is one of those times. We'll see other indications of this as we go. This even helps to date. We're not going to do the dating, but it helps to date this time as to when Joseph was in Egypt. But Joseph is sold to the second in command in all of the land. The captain of the guard means the captain of the inner guard, the captain of the guard that's responsible for Pharaoh's safety. Pharaoh is great house. That's what the word Pharaoh means, the great house. And the person that rules that great house is called great house. But this is the second in command, the captain of the guard. He is an Egyptian man who is trusted completely by some non-Egyptian who sits on the throne. We'll find out that Pharaoh doesn't detest shepherds, but all Egyptians do. What does the Lord do with Joseph in Potiphar's house? Notice chapter 39, verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. God is telling Joseph, I'm with you. I know it was your pride that brought you here. I know it was your brother's prejudice that brought you here. But I want you to know I came with you. I didn't stay in promised land. Of course, I'm making a point here. God's omnipresent. He's everywhere. But he said, I didn't leave you alone. I've come with you, and I'm prospering you in Potiphar's house. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. That would be better translated, became his steward. I know that because of the next line. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. He is Lord of Potiphar's household. He is in control of everything that Potiphar has. Verse 5 says, from the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. He's got everything going his way. All of his goods are prospering. All of his flocks are increasing. He doesn't have to worry about anything. He goes home. He sits down at the table. He eats. He is in total confidence that Joseph is doing everything that needs to be done. But now trouble comes. Everything's going well. Joseph is being blessed. But the seed is not going to be able to be preserved with him as the steward of Potiphar's house. That's not a significant enough position for Joseph to hold for God's will to be done. So now God is going to use the lust of an immoral wife to fulfill his purpose. As he had Tamar and Judah's lust, used them to fulfill his purpose, now Potiphar's wife. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. Here's a good-looking, young, barely, just a little over 17, young man, and she wants to have him, but he refused. Now notice his words with which he refused. He said the magic word, no. That word's hard to misunderstand, isn't it? A friend asked me one time about a certain thing, and I said no, and he kept arguing. And I asked him, what part of no is it that you don't understand? Is it the N or is it the O? What part of it is you don't understand? He said no. But then he gave the reason no. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns has been entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me but you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against, you think he's going to say Potiphar, against my master? He says none of that. How can I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Now I know why Joseph's able to say no. Because number one, he's not that kind of man. Because number two, the trust and the responsibility that his master has given him. And because number three, he's a man of God and he knows God's looking. He will not do it because it'd be a sin against God. Look at verse 10. And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. He tried never to be alone with this woman, because she was constantly after him to commit fornication with her. One day, he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak. She grabbed him. She laid hold on him and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. He was afraid he might. I mean, when the temptation becomes great, that's the time to run. The Bible says flee fornication. The Bible says run from sin. Here's a young man who knew the lust that was within him. And he knew to stay there and to remain with that woman with her insistence that they commit adultery together. He'd have been in bed with her. So he ran, left the cloak in her hand. Hell hath no fury like a woman's scorn, wrote Rudyard Kipling. Let's find out that's true. Verse 13, chapter 39. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, He left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. Lying. But the woman has been scorned, and she tattles on Joseph, just as Joseph had tattled on his brothers. The difference is Joseph has been telling the truth, and this woman is not. He is steward of Potiphar's house. He is tempted by Potiphar's wife, and now he's being framed by Potiphar's wife. Verse 19. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Now, I am not so sure that that anger is because he believes her. Matter of fact, I don't think he believed her. If he believed her, what would happen to Joseph? He'd killed him. And he puts him, we're going to find out later, in a prison in Potiphar's house. He's going to put him in the prison where the captain of the guard's prisoners are kept, in his own prison. And he's going to put him over all that prison. And so I don't think he believes his wife. I think he's angry because he's losing the steward. He's losing the one that has multiplied his goods. And by the way, this may not be the first time she's done this. Egyptian history says that the captain of Pharaoh's guards were always eunuchs. And so perhaps this was his wife only in name, as an honorable position. Maybe she's done this on many other occasions. So as Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So there's Joseph in Potiphar's house. He's steward, he's tempted, he's framed, and now imprisoned. But while Joseph was there in prison, verse 20, the Lord was with him. The Lord followed him into prison. He followed him to Potiphar's house, and now he follows him to Potiphar's prison. The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and he gave him success in whatever he did. He'd been Lord of Potiphar's house, and now he's Lord of Potiphar's prison. Let's see his Potiphar's prison in chapter 40. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody. Watch this. Verse 3, put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard, that's Potiphar, assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. He still trusts Joseph. I don't think he believed that Joseph tried to sleep with his wife. After they'd been in custody for some time, now Joseph's going to interpret dreams. Each of the two men had a dream. In the morning, Joseph sees them sad, and he says, "Why are you sad?" He said, "We both had dreams, but no one can interpret them." He said, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me the dreams." And the chief cupbearer said, "In my dream, I saw a vine in front of me. I pressed the grapes, and I made wine, and I carried unto the Pharaoh, and he drank the cup that's in my hand." This is what this means. In 3 days, the 3 branches of 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head, restore you to your position. You'll put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when that happens, 3 days from now, when you're back in Pharaoh's house and all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcefully carried off from the hand of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put into a dungeon. I'm grateful that this cupbearer is forgetful. We'll find that out in a little bit. The chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, so he says to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread, all kinds of bread. And the birds came and were eating the bread out of the basket on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday. He gave a feast for all of his officials. He lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hands. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Pharaoh had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. What if he'd remembered him? What if he'd told Pharaoh about him? And what if Pharaoh wanted really to honor the cupbearer and he'd gotten Joseph out of prison that day? What's the best Joseph could hope for? To be a minor servant in Pharaoh's house. I'm grateful that God put a forgetful cupbearer in prison. But there's more dreams. There's not only the dreams of the forgetful cupbearer and the faithful baker, but there's the dream of the provident Pharaoh. When 2 full years had passed, God has left Joseph in prison for 2 full years. The butler or the chief cupbearer has forgotten him for 2 full years. At the end of those 2 full years, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river came 7 cows, sleek and fat. Then after them 7 cows, ugly and gaunt. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the sleek and the fat cows. And then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again. And 7 heads of grain were growing, healthy and good, on a single stalk. And after that came 7 other heads of grain, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning he called for all of the masters, magicians, and all of the interpreters of dreams in Egypt to come to him. And he told them the dreams, but no one could interpret the dreams. Nobody in all of Egypt could interpret the dreams. Verse 9 of chapter 41. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. He now remembers at the right time. God keeps a good calendar. Pharaoh was once angry with me, and you sold me into prison. We each had along with the baker, and we both had a dream, and we couldn't get an interpretation. There was a young Hebrew there that told us the interpretation, and things turned out exactly as he said they would. I was restored to my position, and the baker was hung. So Pharaoh, verse 14, sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. That's significant. He is going to honor Pharaoh in his appearance. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, but nobody can interpret it. I understand you can interpret dreams. Look at verse 16. Joseph is no longer proud. He's become an humble servant. I cannot do it. Joseph said to Pharaoh, I cannot interpret your dream, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. He's now giving credit to God and not taking it for himself. Pharaoh repeated the dreams all the way through verse 24, about the cows and about the ears and all that. Nobody could explain it. Verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. 2 dreams, but one meaning. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. And the 7 good heads of grains are 7 years. It's one and the same dream. The 7 lean and ugly cows are 7 years. And the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind, they are 7 years of famine. It's just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it is so severe. The reason God has given to Pharaoh the dream in two forms, given it twice, is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. When God says something once, you can count on him. When he says it twice, it means it's going to happen soon. Now, he gives, after the interpretation, he gives Pharaoh some advice. Starting in verse 33. Now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and a wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. I kind of think Joseph knows what discerning and wise man he's talking about. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 20%, take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance, 20% income tax. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. That's Joseph's advice. Number one, find one wise man to organize it. Get you some commissioners and go gather 20% of everything that is grown, put it in silos, and wait for the famine. And now verse 37. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Now don't get the idea that Pharaoh there is confessing faith in one God. Put it in his terminology, he would say, in whom the Spirit of the gods is, but he recognizes divine revelation in what Joseph is saying. He's not been converted to Jehovah, but he's been converted to the fact that Joseph's God is speaking through him. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one discerning and as wise as you are. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Now that really ends our study of the book of Genesis in this lesson. But we need to think a little bit. A lot of times we read and we come to the end of our study and we don't have time to do this. I'm sure you're doing it on your own. But we need to think about what we've read. What's the lesson in this? What is God doing here? He's preserving a seed. He's still fulfilling that promise in Genesis 3:15, that the seed of the woman will bruise the head of the serpent. And he's using here all of the bad things that have happened to Joseph, even his pride, even his father's prejudice toward him, even the brother's hatred of him, even the Potiphar's wife's evil desires. Everything is a part of God's plan. God is weaving all of this together as a master weaver would do. Have you ever watched anybody weave a rug or weave a garment made out of all kinds of different colors of yarn? I once watched a rug weaver in Madras, India. It was a huge rug, hung from the ceiling to the floor. There was one man sitting up on a stool. It was the master weaver. There were many people, 3 or 4 or 6 on one side and 3 or 4 or 6 on this side. And he'd holler orders, and they'd poke the thread through, and he'd holler orders, and they'd pass it back through. I stood there and watched for about 20 minutes with an interpreter, and they stopped for a tea break. And I spoke to the master weaver, and I said, it's marvelous, marvelous here. Beautiful rug, and not a single mistake has been made in these 20 minutes. And he said, not a single mistake? They made all kinds of mistakes. I said, you didn't stop them? You didn't say, hey, wait a minute, mistake had been made. We got to start over here. He said, well, of course not. Said, I just wove the mistake into the pattern I already had in my mind. You see, God's better than that rug weaver. He knew from eternity the mistakes that people would make. He knew from eternity Joseph's pride. He knew from eternity the brother's hatred. He knew from eternity Potiphar's wife's lust. He knew from eternity the butler and the baker would be in the right prison. Isn't it amazing here that God's working all of this together and weaving it as one would weave a rug together? God is in control of this thing. Is it only of this incident that God is in control? No. God will continue to be in control of Joseph's life throughout all of his life to bring about his will. And he will continue to be in control of your life and my life. If, like Joseph, we will get rid of our pride. We'll let the evil things that happen to us, the mistakes that we make, and the persecution of other people that come upon us, if we'll let that drive us from our pride and drive us to our knees and drive us unto God, then like Joseph, we'll be able to say of us, there's no man as wise as this one is. Joseph is about to become the prime minister of all of Egypt and the second most powerful man in all of the world. Not due to his ability, but due to the fact that he gives God credit and because God is working in his life. Give God credit, and he will work in your life too.